Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. It all started when I found myself in the most unexpected predicament of my life. I'd recently moved to Willow Creek, a small town nestled deep in the Oregon wilderness. My name is Thaddeus Roy. I came here hoping to escape the clamor of city life and find some peace and quiet. Little did I know I'd be trading one kind of chaos for another. I woke up early that morning, as I always do, ready to tackle the day. The year was 2018, and it felt like a fresh start for me. My life had been a series of ups and downs, mostly downs if I'm being honest. I'd spent the better part of my 30s working dead-end jobs, struggling to make ends meet. But here in Willow Creek, I found solace in the simplicity of nature and the warmth of the locals. I was still getting used to the quiet, though. No more car horns, no more shouting neighbors, just the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with some snacks, water, and a flashlight, and headed out. The plan was to hike up to Black Bear Ridge, a local favorite for its stunning views and tranquil atmosphere. It was a routine I'd grown fond of, a way to clear my mind and reconnect with the world around me. The hike started off like any other. The sun peeked through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. I whistled to myself, a tune I barely remembered but somehow found comforting. The trail was well worn, marked by the countless footsteps of those who'd come before me. About halfway up, I stumbled upon a small clearing I'd never noticed before. Curious, I decided to explore. The air felt different here, heavier almost. I shrugged it off and pressed on, my curiosity piqued. That's when I saw it. A strange, makeshift campsite, but it looked abandoned. There were remnants of a fire, charred and cold, and a few scattered belongings, a torn backpack, a rusty canteen, and a couple of old moldy blankets. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something about this place felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew I shouldn't linger. As I turned to leave, I heard a rustle behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the most bizarre creature I'd ever seen. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with matted fur covering its body. Its limbs were long and sinewy, ending in claws that looked like they could tear through steel. But what struck me the most was its face, a twisted, almost human-like visage, but distorted, with sharp features and an unsettling grin. I froze, my mind racing. What the hell was this thing? It looked like something out of a nightmare, an abomination that shouldn't exist in the waking world. It took a step toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Hey, buddy, I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm just passing through." The creature didn't respond. It tilted its head, as if studying me, then let out a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. I didn't need any more encouragement. I turned and ran, my legs pumping like pistons as I tore through the underbrush. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the foliage with terrifying speed. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my vision narrowing to a tunnel focused solely on escape. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Somehow, I made it back to the main trail. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I kept running until I burst out of the forest and into the open, gasping for breath. I collapsed on the ground, my body shaking uncontrollably. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to pull myself together. I had to warn someone. There was no way I could just go back to my cabin and pretend this hadn't happened. I scrambled to my feet and made my way to the nearest ranger station, which was a good mile away. Every step felt like an eternity, the memory of that creature etched into my mind. When I finally reached the station, I burst through the door, startling the ranger on duty. His name was Leonard Markham, a burly guy with a no-nonsense demeanor. "Whoa, easy there. What's going on?" he asked, his eyes wide with concern. There's something in the woods," I panted. "A creature. I don't know what it is, but it's dangerous. We need to do something." Leonard frowned, clearly skeptical. A creature? You sure you didn't just see a bear or something? I shook my head vehemently. No, this wasn't a bear. It was... I don't even know how to describe it, but it looked like it could rip me apart with one swipe. He studied me for a moment, then sighed. All right, let's go take a look. But if this turns out to be some kind of prank, you're buying the first round at the bar tonight. I nodded, grateful that he was at least willing to check it out. We grabbed a couple of rifles and headed back into the forest. The hike back was nerve-wracking, every rustle and snap of a twig making my heart leap into my throat. We reached the clearing and I pointed out the abandoned campsite. Leonard examined it, his expression growing more serious by the second. Okay, I'll admit this is odd, he said, but I don't see any sign of your creature. As if on cue, a low growl echoed through the trees. Leonard's eyes widened and he motioned for me to stay quiet. We crouched down, peering into the forest. There it was, lurking at the edge of the clearing, watching us. Leonard raised his rifle, his hand steady. Stay behind me, he whispered. The creature stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate. Leonard fired a warning shot into the air, but the creature didn't flinch. It kept coming, its eyes fixed on us with a predatory intensity. Back up slowly, Leonard said, his voice calm but firm. We moved together, keeping our eyes on the creature. It matched our pace, maintaining the same distance between us. We continued this tense dance for what felt like an eternity until we finally reached the main trail. The creature stopped at the edge, watching us retreat. Leonard kept his rifle trained on it until we were well out of sight. Back at the ranger station, Leonard made a few calls. Within an hour, a team of armed rangers and local law enforcement arrived. They fanned out into the forest, determined to track down whatever it was that had terrorized me. I stayed behind, feeling a mix of relief and dread. What if they didn't find it? Or worse, what if they did, and it turned out to be something far more dangerous than any of us had anticipated? The hours dragged on. I paced the station, my mind racing with possibilities. Finally, as dusk began to settle over the forest, Leonard and the team returned. They looked shaken, their faces pale. We found it, Leonard said quietly. Or what's left of it. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? He took a deep breath. It was dead, torn apart, like it had been mauled by something even bigger and meaner. We have no idea what could have done that. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt a strange mix of relief and fear. The creature was gone, but something else was out there, something even more terrifying. In the days that followed, the town buzzed with rumors and speculation. Some folks believed it was a bear or a mountain lion, while others whispered about government experiments and cryptids. I tried to put it out of my mind, to focus on my life and move on, but the memory lingered. I never went back to Black Bear Ridge. The forest, once a place of solace, now felt like a sinister labyrinth, hiding secrets I wanted no part of. I stuck to the town, finding comfort in the company of friends and the routine of daily life. One evening, a few months later, I was having a drink with Leonard at the local bar. We talked about everything except that day, but as the night wore on, I couldn't help but bring it up. Do you think we'll ever know what really happened out there? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Leonard shook his head, a wry smile on his lips. Maybe, maybe not. Sometimes it's better not to know. Keeps things interesting. I nodded, pondering his words. He was right, in a way. Some mysteries are best left unsolved, their answers buried in the shadows where they belong. As we finished our drinks and headed out into the cool night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I glanced back at the darkened forest, a shiver running down my spine. I knew I'd never truly escaped the memory of that creature, but I also knew I had to keep living my life, embracing the uncertainty and finding strength in the unknown. In the end, I learned to live with the fear, to accept that the world is full of things we can't explain. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes it so damn fascinating. Months passed, and life in Willow Creek settled back into its usual rhythm. The strange events of that day slowly faded into the background, becoming just another local legend whispered around campfires and at the bar. But for me, the experience had left an indelible mark. I couldn't hike the woods without glancing over my shoulder. couldn't sleep without the eerie memory of those eyes watching me. Then, one chilly morning, something happened that brought it all rushing back. I was in my cabin, enjoying a cup of coffee, when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find a man standing there, dressed in a dark suit and looking out of place in our rustic little town. "Thaddeus Roy?" he asked, his voice calm and authoritative. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, wary. He flashed a badge. "Agent Samuel Graves, FBI, we need to talk." My stomach dropped. "What about—" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "We've been investigating a series of disappearances in this area. People have gone missing, and there have been reports of strange sightings. We believe there's a connection to the creature you encountered." I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my chest. "You think it's still out there?" Graves nodded. "Or something else. We're not sure yet. But we need your help." I spent the next few hours recounting my experience in detail, showing him the spot in the woods where it all happened. As we walked, he asked me questions, probing for any detail I might have missed. "Did you notice any tracks? Any signs of a struggle?" he asked. I shook my head. No, it all happened so fast. One minute I was alone, the next that thing was there. He nodded thoughtfully. "We found tracks, but they don't match any known animal. And the bodies we've recovered, well, let's just say it's unlike anything we've seen before." The sun was setting by the time we returned to my cabin. Graves thanked me for my cooperation and promised to keep me updated. As he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The next few weeks were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Agents came and went, combing the woods and interviewing townsfolk. I tried to stay out of their way, but the presence of the FBI only heightened my anxiety. One night, just as I was about to turn in, there was another knock at my door. This time it was Leonard. "Thad, we need to talk," he said, his face serious. "What's up?" I asked, letting him in. He took a seat at the kitchen table, running a hand through his hair. "The feds think they've found something. They want us to go with them to identify it." A sense of dread settled over me. "Identify what?" He sighed. "Another creature, but this one's different." We met the FBI team at the edge of the forest, where they had set up a perimeter. Agent Graves greeted us, his expression grim. "We found it in a cave, not far from where you had your encounter," he explained. "It's similar, but bigger, more aggressive." We followed him to the cave, the air growing colder with each step. Inside, the smell hit me first, an overwhelming stench of decay. I steeled myself and stepped forward, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. There it was, a hulking mass of fur and muscle lying in a pool of blood. It was even more grotesque than the first creature, with twisted limbs and a maw filled with razor-sharp teeth. Leonard and I exchanged a look, both of us horrified and fascinated. "What the hell is it?" I asked. Graves shook his head. "We don't know. But it looks like it's been feeding on the missing people. We found remains in the cave." I felt sick. The reality of what these creatures were capable of hit me like a freight train. We stood there in silence, the weight of the situation settling over us. Eventually, we left the cave. The image of the creature burned into my mind. The FBI took over from there, promising to keep the town safe and to continue their investigation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only scratched the surface of a much larger mystery. As the weeks turned into months, life in Willow Creek slowly returned to normal. The FBI presence dwindled, and the townsfolk went about their business. But for me, the experience had changed everything. I couldn't look at the forest the same way. Couldn't shake the feeling that there was more out there, lurking in the shadows. I never saw another creature, but the memory of that day stayed with me, a constant reminder of the unknown dangers that lie just beyond our understanding. And as I sat on my porch, watching the sun set over the trees, I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the forest held, waiting to be discovered. You ever have one of those days where nothing seems to go right? It was one of those for me. It was 2015, and I was just a guy trying to make ends meet in Helena, Montana. I had just moved back in with my folks after a rough breakup, trying to sort my life out. My name's Enoch Waller, and that day turned out to be anything but ordinary. My parents had gone to visit my aunt in another town, leaving me to watch the house. It was a lazy Saturday morning, and I had no plans other than to enjoy some peace and quiet. The house was this old creaky thing on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. Perfect for some solitude, or so I thought. Around midday, I decided to take a walk in the woods. It was something I did often to clear my head. I grabbed a bottle of water, slipped on my boots, and headed out. The air was crisp, and the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling were almost therapeutic. I walked deeper and deeper, just following whatever path looked interesting. I found myself in an area I hadn't explored before. It was oddly quiet, like the birds and insects had decided this part of the forest was off limits. I shrugged it off and kept walking. That's when I noticed something odd. A strange smell, like rotten meat mixed with wet earth. It was pungent, almost making me gag. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the scent. It led me to a small clearing, and there in the middle was a mutilated deer carcass. Now, I'm no hunter, but I've seen my fair share of dead animals. This was different. The deer looked like it had been ripped apart by something with serious strength, and not in a clean way like a bear or a mountain lion might do. I felt a chill run through me, but I brushed it off. I mean, this is nature, right? Stuff happens. But then I heard it. A low, guttural noise that sent every hair on my body standing on end. I spun around, trying to pinpoint the source, but saw nothing. The forest was still eerily quiet. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my feet seemed glued to the spot. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move, heading back the way I came. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I picked up my pace, heart pounding in my chest. I was about halfway back when I heard it again, that same noise, but closer this time. I started running, not caring about the path, just desperate to get out of there. I tripped over a root and went sprawling. As I scrambled to my feet, I caught a glimpse of something in the trees. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, sinewy limbs. I couldn't make out its face, but its eyes. They were watching me. I bolted, not daring to look back. When I finally burst out of the trees and into my backyard, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I was breathing hard, adrenaline coursing through me. I told myself I was just imagining things, that it was probably just a bear and my mind was playing tricks on me. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, TV, video games, anything to get my mind off what I had seen. But as evening fell, the sense of unease returned. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see those eyes staring back at me. Around 9 p.m., I heard a noise outside. A heavy thud, like something had landed on the porch. I froze, straining to listen. There it was again, followed by the sound of wood creaking. My mind raced. What the hell could that be? I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a rusty old hatchet my dad kept in the garage, and slowly made my way to the front door. I peered through the peephole and saw nothing. Mustering up some courage, I cracked the door open and stepped outside. The porch was empty, but the air felt thick, like a storm was coming. I took a few steps forward, hatchet raised, and then I saw it. Just beyond the porch light, in the shadows of the trees, it stood. That same hulking figure, watching me. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on it. "Get the hell out of here!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. It didn't move, just kept staring. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door and bolting it. I called the police, my hands shaking as I explained what I had seen. They arrived about 20 minutes later, but of course by then, there was no sign of the creature. They chalked it up to a bear sighting and told me to stay indoors. The officers left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger. I locked all the windows and doors, double-checked everything, and tried to calm down. Just as I was beginning to think I might be overreacting, I heard the scratching. It started softly, like nails on a chalkboard, coming from the back door. I crept over, hatchet in hand, and listened. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. I peeked through the window and saw the door vibrating, as if something was trying to get in. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't know what to do. Call the cops again? They'd think I was losing it. Instead, I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the door. Then, with a splintering crash, the door gave way and the creature barreled in. It was even more terrifying up close. A mass of matted fur, long limbs ending in sharp claws, and a face that was a twisted blend of human and animal features. It let out a guttural noise and lunged at me. I swung the hatchet wildly, connecting with its arm. It howled in pain, but it didn't stop. It swiped at me, claws raking across my chest. The pain was blinding, but I managed to dodge its next attack and scramble toward the kitchen. I grabbed a knife from the counter and faced the creature. It was bleeding, but still very much alive and very angry. It came at me again, and I stabbed it in the side. It howled again, swiping at me with its claws, but I managed to stay just out of reach. The fight was brutal, and I was running on pure adrenaline. I stabbed and slashed, dodging its attacks as best I could. Finally, I managed to drive the knife into its neck. The creature let out a final, gurgling roar and collapsed. I stood there, covered in blood, gasping for breath. The creature lay motionless at my feet. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had to get help. I stumbled to the phone and called the cops again, trying to explain through the pain and shock. When they arrived, they found me slumped on the floor, clutching my bleeding chest. The creature was still there, a grotesque heap of fur and muscle. The officers looked stunned, but they quickly called for an ambulance and secured the scene. I spent a few days in the hospital recovering from my injuries. The police questioned me repeatedly, trying to make sense of what had happened. They couldn't identify the creature, and the whole thing was quickly labeled a bizarre incident. I moved out of my parents' house soon after, unable to stay there after what had happened. The events of that day still haunt me, but I've tried to move on with my life. I never found out what that creature was or where it came from. Some nights I lie awake, wondering if there's more of them out there lurking in the woods. But I survived. And as much as it scared the hell out of me, it also made me realize how strong I can be when I have to be. Life goes on, and so do I. I've had a lot of crazy days, but nothing compares to what went down last year. My name's Brandon Albrecht, and I'm from a small town in Minnesota. We don't get a lot of excitement around here, but I guess that's what makes the story I'm about to tell you even more unbelievable. I don't talk about it much, not because it scared me, but because people look at you like you've lost your mind. It was just another day. So I thought. I'd been having a pretty rough patch. My girlfriend Elise and I had just split up. She moved to the city chasing some big career dream. I stayed back, stubborn as ever, convinced I didn't need anyone. I'd quit my job at the local hardware store too. Some nonsense about finding myself. Really, I just found myself more broke and alone than ever. One morning I decided to get out of town for a bit. I drove my beat-up old truck to Lake Isabella, a serene spot about an hour away. I'd packed a cooler with some beer and snacks, grabbed my fishing gear, and headed out with the plan to just forget everything for a while. The place is pretty remote, surrounded by dense woods, perfect for some solitude. It was an ordinary drive, nothing but the sound of the radio and the hum of the engine. The kind of drive that gives you time to think. I pulled up to my usual spot, a small clearing by the lake. The sun was high, the water calm. Just what I needed. I set up my gear, cracked open a beer, and settled into the quiet. Hours passed. I didn't catch much. Some days are just like that, but I didn't mind. Around midday, I decided to explore a bit. I'd never really gone far into the woods before, always stuck to the lake. This time, though, I had a weird urge to wander. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how still everything was. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I thought it was odd, but didn't think much of it. I kept walking, the thick canopy blocking out the sun, making it feel later than it was. After about an hour, I stumbled upon something unexpected, a small abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The roof was caved in on one side, the wood rotting and covered in moss. My curiosity got the best of me. I had to check it out. Inside, the place was a mess. Broken furniture, shattered glass, old newspapers scattered around. It smelled like damp earth and decay. But what caught my eye was a set of strange symbols carved into the walls. They looked old, like something out of an ancient ritual. Creepy, but I've never been one to believe in ghosts or monsters. Figured it was just some prank by local kids. I was about to leave when I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from beneath the floorboards. My first thought was rats. But as I listened, it became clear it wasn't just random scurrying. It was deliberate, like something trying to get out. Now, I'm not an idiot. I knew better than to mess with whatever was down there. But curiosity got the better of me again. I found a loose board and pried it up. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a small, dirt-covered box. Inside, a collection of old photographs, each one showing different people, all with the same terrified expression, and each photo marked with the same strange symbols from the walls. But it was what was under the photos that really got to me, a set of bones, small ones like those of a child. I dropped the box, my heart racing. This was no prank. This was something much darker. I had to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, I heard a low, rumbling growl. Not from a dog or a bear, something more primal, more menacing. I bolted out of the cabin, running as fast as I could back towards the lake. But no matter how fast I ran, the growl followed, growing louder, more menacing. I glanced back just once, and what I saw made me wish I hadn't. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, covered in matted fur. Its limbs were too long, its posture hunched. But what struck me the most were its eyes. Cold, intelligent, and filled with a hunger I'd never seen before. My brain screamed Bigfoot, but this thing was unlike anything I'd ever imagined. I pushed myself harder, lungs burning, legs screaming. The lake was in sight. If I could just make it to the truck, I'd be safe. But as I reached the clearing, I tripped, falling hard. Pain shot through my leg, but I didn't stop. I crawled, scrambling to my feet, and threw myself into the truck. The thing burst from the tree line just as I slammed the door shut. It hit the side of the truck with a force that shook the whole vehicle. I fumbled for the keys, praying the old engine wouldn't fail me now. It roared to life, and I floored it, gravel flying as I sped out of there. The drive back was a blur. I didn't stop until I was safe inside my house, doors locked, gun in hand. I called the cops, told them everything. They thought I was crazy. Who wouldn't? But they humored me, sent a couple of officers to check it out. They found the cabin, the photos, the bones. But of the creature, there was no sign. They wrote it off as an elaborate hoax, said the bones were probably animal remains, the photos doctored. They didn't believe me. But I knew what I saw. I didn't sleep that night or the next. But as the days passed, life went on. I patched things up with a lease, got a new job, tried to move on. But every now and then, I think back to that day, to those eyes, and wonder if it's still out there, waiting. A few months later, I heard about another hiker gone missing near Lake Isabella. I wanted to warn people, tell them to stay away, but who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. So I kept quiet, kept my head down, and hoped it was all over. But deep down I knew better. Some things can't be forgotten, can't be explained. And some things, no matter how hard you try, will always come back to haunt you. Elise moved back to town, and we tried to pick up where we left off. She noticed the change in me, but I never told her the full story. Just said I had a rough day out in the woods. She didn't push. Probably figured I'd talk when I was ready. I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready. I started carrying a gun with me whenever I went out, even just for a walk. Didn't tell anyone that either. People would think I'd gone off the deep end. But I felt safer, knowing I had some way to protect myself. Even if I wasn't sure a bullet would stop whatever that thing was. One day, I ran into an old friend, Jerry. He's a bit of a conspiracy nut, always talking about government cover-ups and aliens. Normally, I'd brush off his wild stories, but that day I needed to talk to someone who might believe me. So over a couple of beers, I told him everything. To my surprise, he didn't laugh. Didn't call me crazy. Instead, he leaned in, eyes wide, and started telling me about similar sightings all over the country. People disappearing, strange creatures spotted, government officials sweeping it all under the rug. I didn't know if he was right, but it felt good to have someone on my side. Jerry convinced me to go back to the cabin. said we needed to document everything, get proof. I wasn't keen on the idea, but he was persistent, and part of me wanted answers, needed closure. So we made a plan to head out the following weekend. We packed up some gear, cameras, flashlights, even a couple of rifles, and drove out to Lake Isabella. The whole drive I had a knot in my stomach, half expecting that thing to jump out at us. But we made it to the lake without incident. The cabin looked just as I'd left it, eerily quiet and abandoned. We approached cautiously, guns at the ready. Jerry went in first, camera rolling. I followed, heart pounding in my chest. We spent hours there, documenting everything. The symbols, the photographs, the bones. Jerry was like a kid in a candy store, convinced we'd stumbled onto something big. As the sun began to set, we decided to head back. But as we were packing up, we heard it. That same low growl coming from the woods. My blood ran cold. Jerry froze, his camera still recording. We turned to see the creature standing at the edge of the clearing watching us. Jerry raised his rifle, but I stopped him. "Don't," I whispered. "It'll just piss it off." We backed away slowly, keeping our eyes on it. It didn't move, just watched us with those cold, intelligent eyes. We made it to the truck, jumped in, and sped off. We didn't talk much on the drive back. What was there to say? We had the footage, the proof. But who would believe it? Who would want to? Back in town, Jerry uploaded the video to a few conspiracy forums. It got some traction, a lot of people calling it fake, some believing it. But it didn't matter. We knew the truth. And that was enough for me. Life went on. I kept to myself, stayed out of the woods. Elise and I got married, started a family. I never told her the full story, never showed her the footage. Some things are better left unsaid, but every now and then when I'm out walking at night, I feel it. That same cold gaze watching from the shadows. And I know, deep down, that it's still out there, waiting. Years passed. I got older, wiser. I stopped carrying a gun, stopped looking over my shoulder. But the memory of that day never faded. It became a part of me, a reminder that some mysteries are best left unsolved. One day I got a call from Jerry. He'd been digging, found more stories, more sightings. He wanted to go back, gather more evidence. I told him no. Some things are better left alone. He didn't listen. A week later, he was found dead near the cabin, his body torn apart. The official report said it was a bear attack, but I knew better. I knew what killed him. I never went back to Lake Isabella, never told anyone the full story. But I kept the footage, a reminder of the day my life changed forever. And every now and then, when the night is quiet and the air is still, I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting for its next victim. I don't scare easy. But that thing, whatever it was, it scared me, and it killed my friend. So I'll keep telling my story, warning anyone who'll listen. Stay away from Lake Isabella. Stay away from the woods. Because some monsters are real, and they're closer than you think. God damn it, why can't anything ever go smoothly? That was the thought running through my head as I found myself stuck on the side of the road with a flat tire. My name is Eustace Van Gilder, and this all happened back in 1997 in the thick woods of Oregon. I was on my way to visit my old college buddy Nathan, who lived in a cabin off the grid. Nathan had always been the adventurous type, while I preferred the comforts of urban life. But I owed him a visit, and here I was, cursing my luck. Changing a tire isn't exactly my forte. My hands were getting greasy, and I was regretting not having a beer before leaving town. As I fumbled with the jack, I heard a rustling in the bushes. My first thought was a deer, or maybe a raccoon. But then the rustling stopped, replaced by a low, heavy breathing. "Who's there?" I called out, more out of annoyance than fear. Silence. I went back to the tire, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. After what felt like an eternity, I finally got the spare tire on. I threw the tools back into the trunk, slammed it shut, and wiped my hands on my jeans. It was getting dark, and I still had another 30 minutes to Nathan's place. I got back in the car and drove off, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. When I finally arrived at Nathan's cabin, he greeted me with a bear hug and a hearty laugh. "Eustace, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Flat tire," I grumbled. "And something weird in the bushes. I don't know, probably just a critter." Nathan just chuckled. "These woods can play tricks on you. Come on, let's get you a drink." We spent the evening catching up, drinking beer and reminiscing about our college days. Nathan had a way of making you forget your worries, but that strange feeling from earlier lingered in the back of my mind. After a few hours, we decided to call it a night. Nathan showed me to the guest room and I crashed, hoping to sleep off the weirdness. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something scratching at the window. My heart jumped into my throat. I slowly got out of bed and approached the window, peeking through the curtain. There was nothing there, just the dark woods and the faint outline of trees. "Must be a branch," I told myself, trying to calm down. I crawled back into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every little noise seemed amplified, every creak of the cabin making my nerves stand on end. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning, Nathan was already up, making breakfast. "Morning, sunshine," he greeted me with a grin. "Sleep well?" "Not really," I admitted. "Heard something scratching at the window last night." Nathan's smile faltered a bit. "Probably just a raccoon. They're all over the place out here. Don't worry about it." We ate breakfast and decided to go for a hike. Nathan thought it would be a good way to take my mind off things. We packed some gear and headed into the woods. The hike was supposed to be a relaxing stroll, but as we ventured deeper, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At one point, Nathan stopped to tie his boot, and I noticed something in the distance. A figure, tall and hairy, darting between the trees. I froze. "Nathan, did you see that?" He looked up, following my gaze. "See what?" "There's something out there. Looked like, I don't know, like Bigfoot or something." Nathan laughed, but it was forced. "Man, you need to lay off the horror movies? Come on, let's keep moving." We continued, but I was on edge. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. We reached a clearing, and Nathan suggested we take a break. As we sat there, I couldn't help but scan the tree line. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural noise, almost like a growl, but not quite. More like a deep, resonant hum. Nathan's face turned serious. "All right, let's head back." We retraced our steps, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The noises followed us, staying just out of sight. By the time we reached the cabin, I was a nervous wreck. "We need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's something out there." Nathan didn't argue. We packed up our things and got in the car. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin, half expecting to see that figure standing in the doorway. But there was nothing. We made it back to town, and I dropped Nathan off at a motel. "Thanks for the visit," he said, trying to smile. "Next time, let's meet somewhere less wild." "Yeah," I agreed. "Take care, man." I drove home trying to forget the whole experience, but that night as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The noises, the feeling of being watched. It all haunted me. Months went by and I tried to move on with my life. But then, one day I got a call from Nathan's sister. He had gone missing. Vanished without a trace from the motel room where I'd left him. I drove back to Oregon, helping with the search efforts. We combed the woods, retraced our steps from that fateful hike, but found nothing. It was as if he had been swallowed by the forest. The local authorities eventually called off the search, labeling it a cold case. I couldn't accept that. I kept looking, kept searching for any clue, but deep down I knew it was hopeless. Years later, I still think about that day, about what we saw or thought we saw, about the strange noises and the feeling of being watched. Nathan's disappearance remains a mystery, an unsolved puzzle that haunts me to this day. I don't go into the woods anymore. I've moved to the city, where the only things lurking in the shadows are stray cats and the occasional raccoon. But sometimes late at night, I hear that same low hum, and I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting. Nathan was a good man, and he didn't deserve to vanish like that. Wherever he is, I hope he found peace. As for me, I'll keep searching, keep looking for answers. Because some mysteries, you just can't let go. And maybe, just maybe, one day I'll find out what really happened in those woods. But until then, I'll hold on to the memories of my friend, and the eerie, unsettling feeling that something out there knows more than it's telling. As I sit here, writing this, I can't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. Bigfoot? Really? But then I remember the look in Nathan's eyes that day, the seriousness in his voice when he said, "Let's head back." He knew something was wrong. We both did. So here's to Nathan, wherever he may be, and to the mysteries that keep us up at night, reminding us that sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And if you ever find yourself in the deep woods of Oregon, remember this story, because sometimes the things that go bump in the night are all too real. The memory of that night in the cabin has never left me. I see it clearly even now, as if it happened yesterday. It was the night I lost my best friend to something we couldn't explain, something that defied all logic and reason. Nathan and I had always joked about Bigfoot, but neither of us truly believed in such things. We were city boys at heart, even if Nathan had chosen the solitude of the woods. But that night changed everything. It started with the scratching at the window. I thought it was just a raccoon, but then I saw the figure. It was huge, easily over 7 feet tall, covered in thick matted fur. Its face was a grotesque mix of human and animal features, with a wide flat nose and a mouth full of sharp teeth. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Nathan grabbed his rifle, but it seemed like a toy against this monstrous creature. It bared its teeth, a low rumble emanating from its chest. Nathan fired a shot, but it only seemed to anger the beast. The creature lunged at the window, shattering the glass. Nathan pushed me towards the door, shouting for me to run. I stumbled out into the night, hearing the sounds of a struggle behind me. Nathan's shouts, the creature's roars, the crash of furniture being overturned. I didn't stop running until I reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the cabin. I saw the creature standing over Nathan's limp body, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I drove away, my mind racing. What had I just witnessed? What was that thing? I wanted to go back, to help Nathan, but I knew it was too late. I had to get help. When I reached the nearest town, I went straight to the police. They looked at me like I was crazy, but they followed me back to the cabin. By the time we arrived, the creature was gone, and so was Nathan's body. The cabin was in ruins, furniture smashed, bloodstains on the floor. But there was no sign of the creature. The police conducted a search, but they found nothing. No tracks, no traces, nothing to explain what had happened. Nathan was declared missing, presumed dead. I was questioned repeatedly, but my story never changed. They thought I was in shock, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I'd seen. Years passed and I tried to move on with my life, but the memory of that night haunted me. I couldn't forget the creature, couldn't forget Nathan's screams. I became obsessed, researching everything I could about Bigfoot and other cryptids. I joined forums, went on expeditions, anything to find answers. But the truth remained elusive. There were sightings, stories, but nothing concrete. No evidence to prove what I had seen. It was as if the creature didn't exist, a figment of my imagination. Then one day, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, just a plain brown box. Inside was a videotape and a note. The note was simple, written in block letters. "Watch this." I popped the tape into an old VCR, my heart pounding. The video was grainy, but I recognized the setting immediately. It was Nathan's cabin. The camera was shaky, as if the person holding it was nervous. The video showed Nathan, alive and well, sitting at a table with a group of people. They were talking, laughing, drinking. It was like any other night with friends. But then the camera panned to the window, and I saw it. The creature, standing just outside, watching. The video cut out abruptly, but the image was burned into my mind. I rewound the tape, watching it over and over. The same scene, the same creature. It was real. I hadn't imagined it. Nathan was alive, or at least he had been when the video was taken. I contacted the police, showed them the tape. They reopened the case, but once again they found nothing. No leads, no evidence, nothing to explain where Nathan had gone or what had happened to him. The tape was my only clue, a tantalizing glimpse into the mystery. I kept searching, kept looking for answers. But the more I searched, the more questions I had. I don't know if I'll ever find out the truth. But I do know one thing. The creature is real. It's out there, somewhere, and it's watching, waiting. So if you ever find yourself in the deep woods of Oregon, be careful. Because sometimes, the things that go bump in the night are all too real, and they might just be watching you. As for me, I'll keep searching, keep looking for answers. Because some mysteries you just can't let go, and maybe, just maybe, one day I'll find out what really happened in those woods. But until then, I'll hold on to the memories of my friend, and the eerie, unsettling feeling that something out there knows more than it's telling. And if you ever find yourself in the deep woods of Oregon, remember this story. Because sometimes the things that go bump in the night are all too real. It started with a feeling, the kind you get when something's off but you can't quite put your finger on it. I was in the middle of nowhere, Texas, because my buddy Vinny thought it would be a great idea to go camping. Vinny's the kind of guy who thinks the middle of nowhere is an exciting destination. Me, I'm Graham Hollis, and I'm more of a city guy. I like my Wi-Fi strong and my lattes fancy. But hey, Vinny and I go way back, so when he called me up and said, "Graham, you gotta come on this camping trip," I said yes. So here we are, in the middle of June 2020, two old friends out in the sticks with no cell service and nothing but trees and bugs for company. I should have known better. My idea of roughing it is a Motel 6, but Vinny, he's always been the adventurous type. We set up camp in a clearing near a creek, miles away from civilization. Now, I'm not the kind to whine, but I had a rough year. Lost my job, lost my girlfriend, and pretty much lost my will to pretend I enjoyed the outdoors. But Vinny, he's like a damn puppy, bouncing around, setting up tents, starting fires, and talking about how good it was to be away from it all. I just nodded along, sipped on my beer, and tried to enjoy the so-called peace and quiet. It was around dusk when things started to get weird. We were sitting by the fire, roasting marshmallows like we were 10 years old again when we heard it. A rustling in the bushes. Now, I've seen enough horror movies to know that this is usually the part where the dumb city folk get eaten by a bear or some other forest-dwelling nightmare, but Vinny just laughed and said, "Probably a raccoon." But the rustling didn't stop. It grew louder, and then we saw it. A flash of something moving through the trees, something big. Vinny, the idiot, decided to go check it out. He grabbed a flashlight and started walking towards the noise, leaving me alone by the fire. "Hey, maybe don't go poking around in the dark," I shouted after him. "We don't even have a gun." "Relax, Graham," Vinny called back. "It's probably just a deer." I wasn't so sure. I grabbed a stick and poked at the fire, trying to keep my nerves in check. Minutes passed, and then I heard Vinny yell. Not a startled yelp or a shout of discovery, but a scream, a full-on, blood-curdling scream. I jumped up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Vinny!" I shouted. No response. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed a heavy branch from the ground and took off in the direction Vinny had gone. The flashlight beam bounced through the trees, casting eerie shadows everywhere. I ran, tripping over roots and rocks, calling out Vinny's name. And then I saw him. Or rather, what was left of him. Vinny was lying on the ground, his body twisted and broken, his face, oh God, his face. It was frozen in a mask of sheer terror. I stumbled back, dropping the branch, bile rising in my throat. What the hell could have done this? I didn't have time to ponder. There was a low, guttural sound, a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. I turned slowly, the flashlight shaking in my hand, and that's when I saw it. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, covered in matted fur and muscle. Its face was a hideous mix of human and beast, with a jaw that seemed to unhinge as it growled. It had long, powerful limbs and claws that looked like they could tear through steel. My brain screamed Bigfoot, But my gut told me this thing was worse, much worse. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. Running wasn't an option. I'd seen enough horror movies to know that turning your back on the monster was a death sentence. I kept the flashlight trained on it, hoping the light would somehow keep it at bay. The creature took a step forward, its eyes locked onto mine, and I knew I was in deep shit. "Easy now," I muttered, more to myself than to the beast. "Nice and easy." The creature growled again, a deep resonant sound that shook me to my core. It took another step forward, then another. I kept backing up until I felt my foot hit something hard. I glanced down and saw Vinny's body, lifeless and broken. The shock of it jolted me back to reality. I had to move, I had to run. I turned and bolted through the trees, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. I could hear the creature behind me, crashing through the underbrush. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I stumbled into the clearing where our camp was set up and grabbed the first thing I could find. An old flare gun Vinny had packed for emergencies. I spun around, aiming the gun at the tree line, my finger trembling on the trigger. The creature burst into the clearing, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence. I fired the flare. The bright red light shot through the darkness, hitting the creature square in the chest. It roared, a horrible guttural sound, and I took my chance. I ran to the car, fumbling with the keys, praying to every god I could think of that it would start. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the pedal to the floor. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, and I shot down the makeshift road, the creature's roar echoing behind me. I didn't stop driving until I hit the nearest town, a good 40 miles away. The police didn't believe me, of course. They sent a search party out to the campsite, but they never found Vinny's body, just a lot of blood and some huge footprints. They chalked it up to a bear attack, said Vinny must have gotten lost and disoriented. But I knew better. I saw what killed my friend, and it wasn't any bear. I didn't stick around to argue. I got in my car and drove, not stopping until I was back in the city, surrounded by people and noise and civilization. I haven't been back to the woods since, and I never will. Vinny was the adventurous one. He lived for the thrill. But sometimes, the thrill isn't worth the risk. Sometimes, it's better to stay safe, to stay in the light. I still have nightmares, though. Not about the creature itself, but about Vinny. About how I couldn't save him. About how he died, alone and terrified, in the middle of nowhere. And every time I close my eyes, I see his face, twisted in that final scream. I hear his voice, calling out for help that never came. Life goes on, though. I found another job, started dating again, tried to put it all behind me. But some things, you just can't forget. Some things stay with you, no matter how hard you try to move on. A few months ago, I met a guy at a bar who claimed to be a cryptozoologist. Said he was studying Bigfoot sightings in the area. I laughed it off at first, but then he started describing things that sounded all too familiar. The height, the fur, the claws. He showed me pictures of other sightings, blurry and out of focus, but enough to make my skin crawl. I didn't tell him about Vinny, didn't tell him what I saw, but I listened. And I wondered if maybe, just maybe, I wasn't crazy. Maybe there was something out there, something beyond our understanding, something dangerous. So, if you ever find yourself out in the woods, and you hear something rustling in the bushes, do yourself a favor. Don't go check it out. Don't be a hero. Sometimes it's better to leave the unknown alone. Sometimes it's better to be safe than sorry. And sometimes the monsters in the dark are very, very real. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. I moved on with my life, or at least, I tried to. But every now and then I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that creature standing there, watching me. The nightmares didn't help. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in those woods, hearing Vinny's scream, seeing that thing's eyes. One night, after a particularly rough dream, I decided to do some research. Not because I wanted to hunt the creature, or even find out what it was, but because I needed closure. I needed to understand what happened. I spent hours online, reading through forums and articles, watching grainy videos of supposed Bigfoot sightings. Most of it was junk, but some of it felt eerily familiar. I found a few stories that matched my experience almost perfectly. People describing the same creature, the same feeling of dread. Some of them even had pictures, blurry and out of focus, but unmistakably similar to what I saw. I reached out to a few of the authors, hoping for some kind of solidarity, some validation. Most of them didn't respond, but one did. His name was Roy, and he claimed to have seen the creature while hiking in Oregon. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, and had a quiet, serious demeanor. We talked for hours, sharing our stories, comparing notes. He believed the creature was some kind of undiscovered species, a relic from a time when humans weren't the dominant predators. Roy had dedicated his life to finding out more about the creature, to understanding it. He had a small team, a few like-minded individuals who believed in his cause. They spent months at a time out in the wilderness, tracking sightings, collecting evidence. He invited me to join them, but I declined. I'd had enough of the woods for one lifetime. But talking to Roy helped. It made me feel less alone, less crazy. I started to come to terms with what happened. Vinny was gone, and nothing would bring him back. But I could honor his memory by living my life, by not letting fear control me. Months passed, and the nightmares began to fade. I started sleeping better, feeling more like myself. I even went on a few camping trips, though I stuck to well-populated areas, never straying far from the safety of other people. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of my mind, but it didn't control me anymore. And then, one day, out of the blue, I got a call from Roy. He sounded excited, almost frantic. They'd found something, he said. Something big. He wouldn't tell me what it was over the phone, but he insisted I come out to see it. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Maybe it was closure I was looking for, or maybe just curiosity. Either way, I found myself on a plane to Oregon, my heart pounding in my chest. Roy met me at the airport, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes shining with excitement. We drove for hours deep into the forest to a small, secluded cabin. The rest of his team was there, a mix of scientists and adventurers, all of them buzzing with anticipation. They showed me what they'd found. A series of footprints, larger and more defined than any I'd seen before, and hair samples, thick and coarse, unlike anything from known animals. But it wasn't the evidence that convinced me. It was the feeling. That same unshakable feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. I stayed with them for a week, helping where I could, learning as much as possible. They were convinced they were close to a breakthrough, that they would finally capture definitive proof of the creature's existence. I left Oregon with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe they would find the creature, maybe they wouldn't. But I'd done my part. I'd faced my fear and I'd survived. I knew I'd never forget what happened to Vinny, but I also knew I couldn't let it define me. Life goes on, and so do I. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we create in our minds. The real ones, the ones out there in the dark, they're just animals, driven by instinct. And like any animal, they can be understood, even respected. So here's to Vinny, to old friends and new adventures, to facing the unknown and to living without fear. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. My name is Langston Creel, and I swear to God, if it wasn't for my crappy luck, I'd have never ended up in that godforsaken part of the Appalachian Trail last year. I'm a New Yorker by heart, stuck in the grind, always in a rush. But when my girlfriend kicked me out after one too many arguments about my so-called commitment issues, I decided to get lost in nature for a bit. I needed space to think, to breathe, and maybe to figure out what the hell I was doing with my life. So there I was, hiking through the Appalachian wilderness, feeling more out of place than a city rat in a cornfield. It was late September, and the trail was empty save for the occasional deer or squirrel scampering by. The weather was perfect, not too hot, not too cold, and I had enough supplies to last me a week. I figured I'd do some soul searching, maybe find some clarity. By mid-afternoon, I reached a spot known as Devil's Hollow. The name itself should have been a red flag, but I was too caught up in my own thoughts to care. The area was dense, trees looming overhead like silent sentinels, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was eerie, sure, but I wasn't the type to get spooked easily. As I set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I laughed it off, attributing it to paranoia. The isolation was getting to me, I thought, but by dusk, the unease had grown into a palpable tension. I heard rustling in the bushes, snapping of twigs, sounds that shouldn't have been there. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself, trying to keep my cool. I built a fire, hoping the flames would ward off whatever was out there. I sat by the fire, eating a can of beans, when I heard a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but not quite. It sent a chill down my spine, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and scanned the darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. No response, just silence. I knew then that something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I decided to stay awake, keeping my eyes and ears open. Around midnight, the fire was dying, and I was on the verge of dozing off when I saw it. A figure, tall and massive, standing just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, covered in matted fur, with a hulking frame that screamed power and danger. I grabbed my knife, the only weapon I had, and stood my ground. "What the hell do you want?" I shouted, trying to mask the fear in my voice. The creature didn't move, just stared at me with those eyes that seemed almost human but were filled with a primal hunger. It took a step forward, and I instinctively backed up, tripping over my pack and landing hard on my back. The creature moved closer, its heavy breathing audible now. Panic set in, and I scrambled to my feet, knife held out in a feeble attempt to defend myself. Just as it lunged at me, a shot rang out, startling both of us. The creature paused, then let out a blood-curdling scream before disappearing into the woods. I was left shaking, heart pounding, wondering who had fired the shot. A man stepped out from the trees, rifle in hand. He was tall, with a rugged look about him, like someone who belonged in these woods. "You all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but concerned. I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "What the hell was that thing?" He shook his head. "I don't know. Some folks around here call it the Bigfoot, but it's unlike any Bigfoot I've ever heard about." He introduced himself as Amos Thorne, a local hunter who had been tracking the creature for weeks. According to him, it had been responsible for several disappearances in the area, people vanishing without a trace. "I saw your fire from a distance," Amos said. "Figured I'd check it out, make sure you weren't another victim." We packed up my camp quickly and started back towards civilization. Amos led the way, his rifle at the ready. He explained that the creature had been terrorizing the local wildlife as well, leaving carcasses scattered around, half-eaten and mutilated. As we trekked through the woods, the sense of unease never left me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. Amos seemed unfazed, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, alert for any sign of the creature. By dawn, we reached a small cabin where Amos had been staying. It was rustic, but it had all the essentials: food, water, and most importantly, safety. I collapsed on the couch, exhausted from the night's events. "You're lucky to be alive," Amos said, handing me a cup of coffee. "That thing, it's not natural." I took a sip, the warmth of the coffee calming my nerves. "Why are you out here alone, hunting this thing?" Amos sighed, staring into his cup. "Lost my brother to it last year. He was a park ranger, knew these woods better than anyone. When he disappeared, I knew something was wrong. Found his body weeks later, or what was left of it. Been hunting that creature ever since." His words hit me hard. This wasn't just some monster story. It was real, and it had taken lives. "Why didn't you call for backup, get more people involved?" He shrugged. "Tried that. No one believed me. They wrote it off as a bear attack, but I know better. This thing is smart, cunning. It knows how to avoid detection." We spent the day fortifying the cabin, setting traps and preparing for another encounter. Amos was convinced the creature would return, and he wanted to be ready. I helped as much as I could, though my mind kept drifting back to that terrifying moment in the woods. Nightfall came, and we hunkered down, waiting. The hours dragged on, every creak of the cabin making my heart race. Around midnight we heard it again, the same low growl, but this time it was closer. Amos motioned for me to stay quiet as he peered out the window. "It's here," he whispered, his voice tense. He handed me a spare rifle, showing me how to use it. "If it gets in, aim for the head." The next few minutes were a blur of tension and fear. The creature circled the cabin, its heavy footsteps echoing through the night. It tested the windows and doors, looking for a way in. Each time Amos fired a warning shot, driving it back. Finally, with a deafening crash, the creature broke through the door. It was even more terrifying up close, its eyes filled with rage and hunger. Amos fired, hitting it square in the chest, but it barely flinched. I aimed and fired, the recoil almost knocking me off my feet. The shot hit the creature in the head, and it stumbled back, letting out a horrible scream before collapsing to the floor. We stood there, breathing heavily, guns still trained on the lifeless body. "Is it dead?" I asked, my voice shaking. Amos nodded, lowering his rifle. "Yeah, it's dead." The relief was overwhelming, but it was short-lived. The creature's death left more questions than answers. What was it? Where did it come from? And why had it chosen this place to terrorize? Over the next few days, we contacted the authorities, who were skeptical at first but couldn't deny the evidence before them. The creature's body was taken for examination, and experts from various fields were brought in to study it. Amos and I became local legends, the story of our encounter spreading like wildfire. People were both fascinated and terrified by the tale, and many came to see the spot where we had faced the unknown. For me, the experience was life-changing. It made me realize how fragile our existence is, how little we understand about the world around us. It brought me and Amos closer, forging a bond that went beyond friendship. We had faced the unknown together and survived. In the end, the creature was classified as an unknown species, a mystery that would puzzle scientists for years to come. But for me, it was a reminder of the unexpected dangers that lurk in the world, and the strength we find within ourselves when faced with the unimaginable. As for my personal life, well, let's just say it gave me a new perspective on things. I reached out to my ex, mended some bridges, and started appreciating the simpler things in life. That terrifying night in the woods taught me more about myself than any amount of soul-searching could have. And while I'll never forget the fear, the uncertainty, and the sheer terror of facing that creature, it also made me realize that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we don't see. The doubts, the fears, and the regrets that we carry within us. Life went on, as it always does. Amos and I kept in touch, sharing our story with those willing to listen. And every now and then I'd find myself back on the Appalachian Trail, not in fear, but in respect for the unknown, for the mysteries that still exist in this world. Because in the end, it's those mysteries that remind us we're alive, that push us to our limits, and that make us appreciate the beauty of the world no matter how terrifying it can be. It was the kind of morning that slapped you awake with a cold, bracing wind, reminding you that you're alive and have to keep going. I was on my way to Port Orford, Oregon, a small coastal town where I had a bit of family history. My dad used to take me fishing out there, and I'd recently inherited his old fishing cabin. It felt right to go back and see if I could find a piece of him there, even if it was just in the form of a worn-out tackle box or a forgotten whiskey bottle. I'm Eli Waverly. These events happened in 2018, just a few years ago. I was always a bit of a loner, comfortable in my own company. Life hadn't been particularly kind, but I had learned to roll with the punches. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, and my job in Portland was about as exciting as a damp dish rag. I needed a break, and this trip was supposed to be a way to clear my head. I arrived at the cabin just before noon. It was nestled in a grove of evergreens, a stone's throw from the rocky shoreline. The place looked exactly as I remembered it, small, rustic, and somehow comforting. I dumped my bag on the creaky wooden floor and set about airing out the musty rooms. The smell of the sea was strong, mingling with the scent of pine and old wood. By the time I'd unpacked and made myself a sandwich, it was early afternoon. I decided to take a walk down to the beach. The tide was out, and the beach was littered with driftwood and seaweed. As I strolled along, memories of my dad teaching me to cast a line came flooding back. I smiled at the thought of those simpler times. I hadn't seen a soul since arriving, which was just fine by me. I was savoring the solitude until I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the sand, but they were unlike any I'd ever seen. They were huge, with long splayed toes and deep impressions that suggested something, or someone, very heavy had passed through. My first thought was that it might be some kind of prank, but who would be out here in the middle of nowhere pulling stunts like this? I shook off the unease and continued my walk, trying to ignore the creeping feeling that I was being watched. The footprints continued down the beach, leading into the forest. I turned back, deciding I'd had enough fresh air for one day. As I headed back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, as I sat by the fireplace, nursing a bottle of my dad's favorite whiskey, I heard it. A sound like nothing I'd ever heard before, a sort of screeching howl, far off in the distance. It sent chills down my spine. I'm not one to spook easily, but that sound was unnerving. I tried to tell myself it was just a coyote or some other animal, but deep down I knew it was something else. I locked the doors and windows, feeling foolish for being so jumpy. I went to bed with the sound of the wind and the waves outside, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing that howl in my mind over and over. I woke up at dawn, groggy and out of sorts. The night before felt like a bad dream. I decided to check out the forest where those strange footprints had led. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a pocket knife, I ventured into the dense woods. The morning light struggled to penetrate the thick canopy, casting eerie shadows all around. As I followed the path of those footprints, the forest grew darker and more oppressive. The sounds of the ocean faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. I knew I should turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. I stumbled upon a small clearing, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. It was a pile of animal bones, picked clean and arranged in a haphazard heap. Nearby, the ground was disturbed, as if something had been digging. I took a step closer and noticed a tattered piece of fabric, what looked like part of a jacket, caught on a low branch. I recognized it immediately. It was my dad's old fishing jacket. He always wore it when we went out on the boat. But how it had ended up here? Suddenly I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing. The forest was silent again, almost too silent. I backed away slowly, not wanting to turn my back on whatever might be out there. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. Something tall and covered in matted fur. It moved with a grace that belied its size, and my mind raced with possibilities. Was this the creature that made those footprints? Was this the thing that had howled in the night? I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise I was making. I just wanted to get back to the cabin, back to safety. My breath came in ragged gasps as I burst out of the forest and onto the beach. I didn't stop until I was inside, with the door locked and bolted behind me. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the local sheriff's office, but of course there was no signal. I cursed my luck and paced the cabin, trying to figure out what to do. I wasn't armed, and even if I was, I doubted a gun would do much good against whatever that thing was. Hours passed and the daylight started to fade. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see that creature lurking outside. As night fell, the wind picked up, howling around the cabin like a living thing. I huddled by the fireplace, clutching my pocket knife and trying to stay awake. Around midnight, I heard it again. That screeching howl, closer this time. It was followed by a series of guttural grunts and the sound of something heavy moving through the trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. The noises grew louder, and I knew it was coming closer. I moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon was bright, casting an eerie light over the landscape. At first I saw nothing, but then I caught a glimpse of movement. There it was, standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with long shaggy fur and a hunched posture. Its eyes glinted in the darkness, reflecting the light like twin points of fire. I backed away from the window, trying to stay calm. I had to think. I couldn't stay here and wait for it to break in. I had to find a way out. I grabbed my bag and stuffed it with whatever supplies I could find. Flashlight, food, water, my dad's old hunting knife. I slung the bag over my shoulder and headed for the back door, hoping to slip out while the creature was still at the front. As I opened the door, the wind howled louder, masking the sound of my footsteps. I crept around the side of the cabin, keeping low and moving as quietly as I could. The creature was still at the front, sniffing around the porch. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't notice me. I made it to the edge of the clearing and slipped into the forest, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The trees closed in around me, and I felt a strange sense of relief. The forest was dark and foreboding, but at least it offered some cover. I followed the path I'd taken earlier, hoping to find my way back to the beach. The sounds of the creature faded behind me, and I allowed myself to relax a little. I had to keep moving, had to get as far away from the cabin as possible. After what felt like hours, I emerged onto the beach, breathing a sigh of relief. The tide was coming in, and the sound of the waves was comforting. I followed the shoreline, hoping to find a road or some sign of civilization. As dawn approached, I spotted a small fishing boat anchored just offshore. I waved frantically, hoping to get the attention of whoever was on board. A man appeared on deck, squinting at me through the early morning light. He shouted something I couldn't hear over the roar of the waves, then lowered a dinghy into the water. I waded out to meet him, my legs shaking with exhaustion and relief. As I climbed into the boat, I felt a strange sense of disbelief. Had it all really happened? Had I really encountered some kind of creature in the forest? The man, whose name was Hank, listened to my story with a mixture of skepticism and concern. He didn't say much, just nodded and steered the boat back to his cabin a few miles down the coast. I spent the rest of the day there recovering and trying to make sense of everything. When the local authorities arrived, I told them everything. They searched the area around my cabin but found no sign of the creature. The footprints had been washed away by the tide, and the clearing in the forest showed no signs of disturbance. In the end, they chalked it up to an overactive imagination and the stress of being alone in a remote place. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that somewhere out there that creature is still roaming the forest, waiting for its next victim. I decided not to sell the cabin after all. I boarded it up and left it to the elements, a ghost of my past that I had no desire to revisit. I returned to Portland, grateful for the safety and familiarity of the city. Life went on, and I tried to put the experience behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that screeching howl in my dreams, and I remember the creature in the forest. It's a memory that will stay with me for the rest of my life, a reminder of the things that lurk in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. It was the kind of day that starts off normal but ends up changing your life. I was looking for a bit of solitude, so I decided to head out to the Hoosier National Forest. I'd always found a strange sort of peace among the trees, where the air smells of pine and earth. My name is Alaric Voss, and this happened in 2016. I never considered myself an outdoorsman, but the occasional hike was my way of escaping the pressures of my life. You know, just trying to clear my head. I'd had a rough year. My fiancée Lucinda had left me for some yoga instructor named Brent, and my job as an accountant was driving me up the wall. Nothing like finding out the woman you thought you'd spend your life with preferred a guy who did downward dogs for a living. But I digress. I packed my bag with the usual. Water, some trail mix, and my old Swiss Army knife, more for nostalgia than any practical use. It was mid-morning when I started on the trail. The sun filtered through the dense canopy, creating a mosaic of light on the forest floor. Birds were singing, squirrels were doing whatever squirrels do, and for a while, it was perfect. Just me, the trees, and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. About an hour in, I noticed something odd. The usual forest noises had dimmed, and it felt like the woods were holding their breath. I shrugged it off and kept walking, figuring it was just my city boy paranoia acting up. I reached a clearing, a beautiful spot with wildflowers and a small stream. I decided it was as good a place as any to take a break. I sat on a fallen log, munching on my trail mix, when I first saw it. Across the clearing, partially hidden by the undergrowth, was something large and dark. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. Bear, maybe? But it didn't move like a bear. Its limbs were too long, its body too lean. Whatever it was watching me. "Hey there," I called out, half expecting it to scamper away. Instead, it moved closer, stepping into the light. My breath caught in my throat. It stood on two legs, towering over me by at least a foot, covered in coarse, dark fur. Its face was a nightmare, a grotesque mix of human and beast, with a gaping maw full of teeth. I froze. It stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Slowly, it started to circle the clearing, never taking its eyes off me. I realized then that my knife was in my bag, out of reach. Not that a pocket knife would do much against something like this. "Easy now," I muttered more to myself than to the creature. Just stay calm." The creature tilted its head, almost as if it was curious. Then, without warning, it lunged at me. I rolled off the log, barely dodging its grasp. My heart was pounding in my chest as I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't look back. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me. My mind was racing. I needed to get to my car, but the trail seemed to stretch on forever. I stumbled and fell, scraping my hands and knees. The creature was gaining on me, its heavy breaths and guttural sounds growing louder. Suddenly, I burst out onto the main trail and nearly collided with another hiker. "Help! We need to go now!" I yelled. The guy, a tall man with a grizzled beard, looked at me like I was insane. "What the hell's wrong with you?" he asked. But then he saw it. The creature had emerged from the woods, and for a moment we both stood there in shock. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him along. We sprinted down the trail, the creature hot on our heels. The parking lot was in sight when the man tripped and fell. He screamed as the creature pounced on him. "Go! Just go!" he shouted at me, struggling to fend off the beast. I hesitated, torn between helping him and saving myself, but the fear took over, and I kept running. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking. As I got the door open, I glanced back to see the creature dragging the man into the woods. His screams echoed in my ears as I floored the gas pedal and sped out of there. I drove straight to the nearest town, my mind racing. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. I found a small diner and stumbled inside, still in shock. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, took one look at me and called the sheriff. When the sheriff arrived, I told him everything. He listened, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "Sounds like you had a close call with a bear," he said finally. "But we'll check it out." A search party was organized, and they combed the woods for any sign of the creature or the man. They found nothing. No tracks, no blood, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. The sheriff pulled me aside. "Look, Alaric, I don't know what you saw out there, but we've got no evidence of anything unusual. My advice? Stay away from those woods." I nodded, feeling numb. The guilt of leaving that man behind weighed heavily on me, but what could I have done? That thing was a monster. Weeks passed, and I couldn't shake the images from my mind. I did some research, trying to find any information on what I'd encountered. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, skunk ape. The internet was full of theories, but none of them matched what I'd seen. This thing was different, more malevolent. One night I got a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was shaky. "You're the guy from the forest, right?" "Who is this?" I asked. "My name's Fenton. I saw it too, a few years back. Same place. It killed my brother." My blood ran cold. "What did you do?" "Nothing. There's nothing you can do. Just stay away, man. It's not something you can fight." I thanked him and hung up, feeling more lost than ever. I decided to move. to get as far away from those woods as possible. I found a new job in a different state and tried to put it all behind me. But some nights when I close my eyes, I see that clearing, hear those screams, and wonder how many others have fallen victim to the beast in the Hoosier National Forest. The memory of that day will haunt me forever, but I've learned to live with it. I guess we all have our demons. Some are just more real than others. The creature's attack was not just random. Fenton later told me that it seemed to target specific people, those who were alone or vulnerable. It was almost like it had a twisted sense of justice, preying on those who it deemed worthy of its attention. But why? No one could say for sure. Months after I moved, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single yellowed newspaper clipping. It was from the 1950s, detailing a series of mysterious disappearances in the Hoosier National Forest. The descriptions of the creature matched mine exactly. I shivered as I realized that this thing had been out there for decades, maybe even longer. I knew I could never go back to those woods, but a part of me wanted to understand. What was it? Where did it come from? And most importantly, why did it choose to reveal itself to me? Life went on. I got a new apartment, made some new friends, even started dating again. But I kept the letter and the clipping in a drawer, a reminder of the day that changed everything. Sometimes late at night I'd take them out and read the article, trying to piece together the mystery. One evening I got a call from Lucinda. We hadn't spoken since she left, and hearing her voice brought back a flood of memories. "Alaric, I heard what happened. Are you okay?" I sighed. "Yeah, I'm managing. It's been a lot to process." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about everything. I never meant to hurt you." "Water under the bridge," I said, though it still stung. We talked for a while, catching up on life. It was strange, but comforting, like talking to an old friend. Before she hung up, she said something that stuck with me. "You always had a knack for finding trouble. Just stay safe, okay?" It was meant as a joke, but there was a truth to it. Trouble seemed to find me, no matter where I went. I made a promise to myself to be more cautious, to avoid situations that might lead to danger. But deep down, I knew that some things were beyond my control. Years passed, and the memory of that day slowly faded, though it never disappeared completely. I still hiked, but always in well-populated areas. I never went into the deep woods alone again. One day I was watching the news when a report caught my attention. A hiker had gone missing in the Hoosier National Forest. The search was ongoing, but there were no leads. My heart ached for the family, knowing all too well what they might be facing. I thought about contacting the authorities, telling them what I knew, but what could I say? That a creature from a nightmare was responsible? They'd think I was crazy. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to do something. I reached out to Fenton again, asking if he'd heard about the latest disappearance. He hadn't, but he wasn't surprised. "It never stops, Alaric. It's always hungry." I decided to write down my story, to document everything that happened. Maybe it wouldn't make a difference, but at least the truth would be out there. I sent copies to local newspapers, online forums, anywhere that might listen. Some people responded with curiosity, others with skepticism, but I felt a sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted. The story gained a small following, mostly among those who believed in the supernatural. A few months later, I received another letter, this time from a man named Dr. Everett, a cryptozoologist. He wanted to meet and discuss my experience. We met in a coffee shop, a quiet place where we could talk without interruptions. Dr. Everett was an older man, with a kind face and a keen interest in the unknown. He listened intently as I recounted my story, asking questions and taking notes. When I finished, he leaned back and sighed. "I've been studying these creatures for years, Alaric. What you encountered is rare, but not unheard of. They're intelligent, capable of understanding and adapting to their environment." "But why me?" I asked. "Why did it come after me?" Dr. Everett shook his head. "That's the mystery. Some believe they have a sense of justice. Others think they're simply territorial. Whatever the reason, you were unlucky enough to cross its path." We talked for hours, and by the end, I felt a strange sense of closure. I wasn't alone in my experience. Others had seen similar things, faced similar fears. It didn't make it any less terrifying, but it made it more bearable. Dr. Everett thanked me for sharing my story and promised to keep in touch. As I left the coffee shop, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe I couldn't change what happened, but I could help others understand, prepare them for the dangers that lurked in the shadows. Life continued, and I found happiness in small things. A good book, a long walk, a laugh with friends. The memory of that day would always be with me, but it no longer defined me. I had faced my fear and come out the other side, stronger and wiser. In the end, that's all any of us can do. Face our fears, learn from our experiences, and move forward. The creature in the Hoosier National Forest is still out there, waiting for its next victim. But I've learned to live with that knowledge, and to appreciate the moments of peace and joy that life offers. And who knows, maybe one day, someone will find a way to stop it. Until then, I'll keep my memories close, a reminder of the day that changed everything. I've always hated camping. It's not that I'm afraid of the woods or anything. It's just the idea of sleeping on the ground, dealing with bugs, and being miles away from the nearest decent cup of coffee. My name is Kellen Highland, and in 2015 I found myself roped into a camping trip with a few old friends from college. They had this idea that a trip to the Sierra Nevada mountains would be the perfect way to reconnect. I should have known better. We'd all gathered at this spot we used to hike to back in the day, a remote lake nestled high in the mountains, surrounded by thick pines and towering peaks. The place was beautiful, I'll give it that. But beautiful can quickly turn into terrifying under the right circumstances. My buddy Ren was the ringleader of this operation. He was always the adventurous type, the kind of guy who would suggest cliff diving into an icy river just for fun. Then there was Eli, the sarcastic, skeptical one, who constantly made jokes about us getting eaten by bears. Nico was the quiet one, but also the most knowledgeable about the outdoors. And then me, well, I was the reluctant participant, dragged along more for old time's sake than for any love of nature. We arrived at the lake around noon. Setting up camp was surprisingly smooth. Ren and Nico handled most of it while Eli and I complained about the lack of cell service. We spent the afternoon fishing, lounging around, and reminiscing about the past. By nightfall, we had a decent fire going and were grilling the fish we'd caught. That's when things started to get weird. It began with strange noises coming from the woods. At first, it was just the typical rustling of leaves and snapping of twigs. Nothing unusual. But as the night wore on, the sounds became more pronounced. It was like something or someone was moving around us, staying just out of sight. Probably just a deer or something, Ren said, poking at the fire. He was trying to sound nonchalant, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Yeah, or a serial killer, Eli chimed in, rolling his eyes. Great idea, Ren. Middle of nowhere, no cell service, perfect setting for a horror movie. Shut up, Eli, Nico muttered. He was peering into the darkness, his face serious. It's probably nothing. We all tried to brush it off, but the atmosphere had changed. The light-hearted banter of earlier was replaced by a tense silence. We kept our conversation low, almost as if we were afraid of being overheard. Around midnight, the noises stopped. There was an eerie stillness in the air, a silence that was almost oppressive. We decided to call it a night, retreating to our tents. I was sharing a tent with Eli, and as we settled into our sleeping bags, he whispered, "You think it's a bear?" "Could be," I replied, though I didn't really believe it. Bears usually don't stick around humans unless they smell food, and we'd been careful about storing ours. "Just go to sleep, man." I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew I was jolted awake by Eli shaking me. "Listen," he hissed. I strained my ears and heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping sound like heavy footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest. This was no deer, and it certainly wasn't a bear. I grabbed the flashlight from beside my sleeping bag and clicked it on. "Stay here," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was saying it more for Eli's benefit or my own. I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a weak glow over our campsite. Ren and Nico were already up, standing by the remains of the fire, their faces pale in the dim light. "You hear that?" Ren asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I replied. "What the hell is it?" Nico shook his head. "I don't know, but it's close." We stood there paralyzed, listening to the heavy footsteps circling our campsite. They seemed to be coming from all directions, an impossible feat unless there was more than one of whatever was out there. "Maybe we should leave," Eli said from behind me, his voice trembling. "Leave and go where?" Ren snapped. "We're miles from the car, and stumbling around in the dark isn't exactly a smart move." As we debated our next move, the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. We stood there holding our breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then we saw it. A massive figure emerged from the trees, standing just at the edge of the firelight. It was tall, at least 8 feet, with broad shoulders and a muscular build. Its skin was rough and dark, almost like tree bark, and its eyes, well, let's just say they were the stuff of nightmares. I can't describe them, but the way they looked at us, it was like they were boring into our souls. "What the fuck is that?" Eli whispered, his voice barely audible. The creature took a step forward, and I felt a primal fear grip me. This wasn't some animal we could scare off or a person we could reason with. This was something else entirely, something out of a nightmare. Ren, ever the idiot, grabbed a burning stick from the fire and held it out like a torch. "Back off," he yelled, though his voice wavered. The creature didn't even flinch. It took another step forward, and I realized with a sinking feeling that we were completely outmatched. We had no weapons, no way to defend ourselves against something like this. "Run," Nico said suddenly. "We need to run." Without waiting for a response, he took off into the woods. The rest of us hesitated for a split second before following suit. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping against our faces, the creature's heavy footsteps pounding behind us. I don't know how long we ran. Minutes, hours, it all blurred together. We eventually burst out onto a dirt road, gasping for breath. The creature was nowhere in sight, but we didn't stop running until we reached a small ranger station about a mile down the road. We banged on the door until a sleepy-looking ranger opened it. "What's going on?" he asked, looking us over. "There's something out there," Ren said, his voice shaking. "Something big." The ranger frowned, but let us inside. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the station, too scared to sleep. The ranger called for backup, and by morning a team of officers arrived to investigate. They didn't find anything, no footprints, no signs of a struggle, nothing. It was like the creature had never existed. The officers chalked it up to an overactive imagination, or maybe even a group prank. But we knew what we'd seen, and there was no way we were going back to that lake. As for the creature, I don't know what it was or where it came from. Maybe it was some kind of undiscovered species, or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that I'm never setting foot in those woods again. Ren moved to the East Coast shortly after that trip, and I haven't seen him since. Eli still jokes about our Bigfoot encounter, but there's an edge to his laughter that wasn't there before. Nico, well, he doesn't talk about it at all. And me, I stick to the city now. The closest I get to nature is the park down the street from my apartment. Some things are better left unexplored. In the end, we survived, but we were changed. Not in the dramatic, life-altering way you see in movies, but in a subtle, creeping way that makes you second-guess every rustle of leaves and every shadow that moves in the corner of your eye. As for that creature, who knows? Maybe it's still out there, roaming the woods, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers. Or maybe it's moved on to some other remote corner of the world. All I know is, if you're ever in the Sierra Nevada mountains and you hear something strange in the woods, don't stick around to find out what it is. Run, and don't look back, and that's the story. It's not one I like to tell often, but sometimes it helps to get it off my chest. It was a hell of a night, and it's one I won't soon forget.